that I like to go through. Oh, perfect. Thank you so much, sir. I appreciate that. Good morning, everybody. This is the workshop 1 part of phase 4 for the RDF proceeding, rulemaking 20-07-013. I'm going to start us off with a safety message, just as folks are rolling in. So we are starting to wrap up the camping season here in California, but as the temperatures drop, I am imagining folks are probably excited about gathering around a campfire to stay warm. The National Park Service actually reports that nearly 85% of wildfires in the US are caused by human activities like leaving campfires unattended and burning unapproved fuel sources. So stay safe and be cautious when using fire pits and grills. So for responsible uses of fire pits and grills to minimize the risk of accidental fires that can lead to wildfires, here are some important safety tips. Always supervise fires. Keep a close eye out on your fire and never leave it unattended. Ensure that children and pets are kept at a safe distance from fire pits, lighters, and matches. Choose a safe location. Position your fire pit or grill away from flammable materials and structures such as tree branches and building eaves. Use fire pit screens to contain your fire and prevent sparks from escaping. Use approved fuels. Use dry wood or approved charcoal and avoid accelerants that could lead to dangerous flare-ups. And then extinguish properly, right? When you're finished, completely douse your fire with water to ensure all embers are extinguished. And after each use, clean your grill to remove the grease that could light on fire, and dispose of cooled ashes and coals in a container with a lid to prevent them from blowing away and igniting fires in other areas. And we found a little link for you guys to do some extra research if you're interested. I want to thank our intern Annabelle Gensler for providing us this safety message. She's been developing a couple for us in this workshop series, so I'm giving her a shout out because she won't be able to join us today. Hey, I'll also just mention that in terms of fire grill safety, I actually once, when I was like 5 years old, put my hands on a warm grill that I didn't know my father had used like about 10 minutes beforehand. And I don't know who it was more traumatic for, me or my poor mother, but I do appreciate the fire safety message today. That memory will never go away. Okay, so this meeting will be recorded. It already is recording. One or more decision makers may be present during the meeting, but no decisions will be taken. Let's do a quick roll call. I know I've heard from some of you, but just to make sure, is the Public Advocate's Office on the line?
Yes, we are here.
Yes.
Hey, Pacific Gas and Electric companies. So PG&E. That was pretty faint. Was that Hannah? Might be an audio issue for Hannah. How about I circle back in just 1 second, Hannah? We'll ask you again. Anyone from the Sempra companies?
Can you hear me?
Oh, hi, Vincent. Yes, we can hear you. And we can see it. All right, perfect. Anyone from the Sempra companies? Having some audio problems maybe for the Sempra companies as well.
Rick Haynes from SDG&E.
Okay, great. All right. Glad to have at least one of you up and running. SCE, Southern California Electric. Edison, wow.
Good morning.
Hey, Eddie, this is Brian Landry. We have a few others joining as well.
Yep. Good to see both Brian and Russell. Thank you for the shout out.
Good morning.
Anyone from Mussey Grade Road Alliance, MGRA?
Joseph Mitchell.
Hi, Joe. Good to see you. Dr. Mitchell. Anyone from the Utility Reform Network? Anyone from TURN? Okay. If someone from TURN comes on in a minute, they can put it in the chat. Anyone from Protect Our Communities Foundation? Anyone from Energy Producers and Users Coalition and Indicated Shippers, EPUC-IS?
Yes, this is Colin Fitzhenry representing the EPUC and Indicated Shippers.
Okay, and one last participant, one last party, Utility Consumers Action Network. Anybody from UCAN? Okay. Are there any other parties who would like to be recognized? Okay, great, Shalal. Good to see you. Or good to see your message. If there are any others that would like to be recognized, please put your message in the chat. Quick note on the agenda. We're going to be relatively fixed just to accommodate everybody's schedules. And we're only going to be flexible around the break if that's necessary and if there's a consensus to do so. My presentation will be, about 30 minutes, but probably I'll be able to wrap it up pretty quick and so we can get directly into the Q&A. If someone could remind me to save the chat history before the meeting ends, I'd really appreciate it. Let's just go over some attendee participation rules. If you have any IT related questions, they can be directed to Jacob Willman. And Jacob, could I trouble you to place your email in the chat so that folks have it? And attendees have the ability to mute and unmute themselves. Attendees, we're going to ask everyone to try and stay muted except during the Q&A period. And during the presentation portion of the session, everyone can enter questions into the chat box and make sure that you actually address the questions to everyone so that we all get a chance to see them. Now, if there are any clarifying questions during the presentation, please raise your hand and we will try to address those questions in turn. But we would really appreciate it if you could hold any non-clarifying questions until the discussion period. And if there's not enough time to respond to all of the questions in the chat box during the workshop, SPD will collect answers to those questions and circulate them to the service list after the workshop. During the discussion, please use the hand raise function to speak, and we will do our best to call on each of you in order. And after the question is asked, please remember to lower your hand so that we don't ask you again. Let's see, I think we will now hand it over to Suzanne Thomas to give us some opening remarks.
Thanks, Eddie. Good morning, everyone. My name is Suzanne Thompson. I'm Chief of Staff and Legal Advisor for Commissioner John Reynolds, the assigned commissioner to this rulemaking. Commissioner Reynolds is very interested in finding ways to improve our frameworks for decision-making in the safety context, and that's the prime work here at the RDF proceeding. I want to start by saying thank you to Safety Policy Division for hosting today's workshop and facilitating the discussion, and to all the parties here today for their feedback and participation. And big thank you to our IT staff for their support in this virtual workshop today. Defining scope of work is a key concept to better improve the transparency and accessibility of information in the context of ramps and GRCs. And as we plan to use metrics such as benefit cost ratios for comparative purposes, the usefulness of those metrics depends on some common understanding of how the work of mitigating risk is being chunked out. How do we make meaningful and informative comparisons between different types of work? What is the level of detail that is useful and actionable for interveners as they seek to participate and offer their own proposals in GRCs and in other commission proceedings? These questions get weedy quickly, but we really appreciate and encourage parties' candid feedback and creative ideas for how to improve transparency and access to this really important foundational information. So with that, I conclude my remarks and turn it back to you, Eddie.
Thanks, Suzanne. I appreciate it. I'm going to do a quick just review of the timeline, specifically for track one. This is obviously workshop one. We're going to be talking about the definition of scope, but down in November, we're going to be having a 3-day workshop actually, where we'll be discussing residual risk, overall residual risk, risk tolerance, and simple optimization. And then later on in December, we'll be discussing the risk mitigation accountability report, or what we describe as RMAR. So keep a lookout for updates to those later workshops that are coming down the pipe. And then also just a note that phase 4 will also have a track 2, where we'll have technical working groups to discuss data templates for the ramp and the GRC. And I am planning in early December, I believe, to issue a kind of a process for those technical working groups, I'll email that out to the service list, and that should give everyone a bit more context as to how we expect those projects to move forward. Okay. Just some expected workshop or outcomes for this workshop. Obviously, we're going to be discussing the definition of scoped work, and I'll also be introducing the concept of the risk reporting unit, and we'll discuss if that alternate terminology is a better fit for the RDF, and we'll think about the way that these concepts fit within the context of the risk-based decision-making framework. And so we're looking for feedback on how the commission should define scoped work or some derivative term, and how that should be integrated, how that should be properly integrated into the RDF. And now I'm going to go ahead and start into our presentation. So I'm going to dive right in and just say that while the staff proposal provides a pretty detailed review of projects in the concept of RAMP and GRC filings, and I'm hoping, I sent that out a couple weeks ago, so hopefully all of you had a bit of time to read through that. But for this workshop, staff would like to focus on the discussion of scope work. And so we'll focus on some of the foundational concepts within the definition that we're proposing. And then we'll introduce the risk reporting unit and why we feel that that's a better and more appropriate term to use for this particular concept. And then hopefully we'll move through most of the slide deck pretty quickly so that we can have plenty of time for discussion. Did somebody come off audio and have a question? Okay, if not, I will keep moving. So please note that the definition for scope work developed in the staff proposal intends to mirror the definition of mitigation program or control program. This is because scope work must aggregate up to the program level. That's our expectation. The definition for program is found in row 28 of the RDF. And as we'll discuss later on, we recommend adding program to the formal list of definitions in the RDF. In addition, scope work must be traceable through its life cycle, which we'll discuss in the next slide, as well as forecastable and auditable. And just a note that occasionally I may slip and just use the term mitigation for brevity's sake, but unless I'm specifying it somewhere, I think everything that we're going to discuss today is relevant to both controls and mitigations. So here we are referring to the terms that make up the definition of scope work within this slide. And we can always return to these slides if folks have questions on them. So we see the first few terms as being central to understanding the life cycle of scope work. The utility should be able to describe how each phase of the life cycle is undertaken. There may even be specific steps that can be described within each phase. And I can come back to this later on in the discussion. But scope work must be forward-looking, at least to the third post-test year. That way, the utility can make estimates of risk reduction and cost at the scope work level through a GRC period. And it needs to be backward-looking as well to make sure an auditor can determine if the final recorded costs are incremental to costs authorized in previous GRCs or other cost recovery proceedings. So these features would also be synonymous with the way a mitigation program or control program is both forward and backward-looking. And staff recognize that utilities face a diverse set of enterprise risks with unique characteristics. And we did have a few examples, of these challenges within the staff proposal. And we do want to talk through those examples in the discussion, particularly around whether or not the asset in a scope work needs to be contiguous, or whether or not a scope work can be associated with a single very complex asset. However, we would like to come back to those questions in our discussion, and we have a slide that's actually dedicated to those types of questions. So I just noticed in the chat, Chris, that you're having audio problems. Everyone has the ability to turn their audio on and off. so I'm not entirely sure why you're having difficulty with audio. Anyone at SE can confirm that they have audio?
I have audio. This is Russell.
Okay. So Chris, it might be an issue on your end.
What I had to do is unplug from my docking station and just use my laptop as a standalone device. Not sure why that worked, but it did.
Interesting. I heard someone recently, I think James Dewey had a similar issue. So Chris, I hope that helps. Yep. We'll come.
Chris, this is Jacob from CPU-CIT. I've requested it unmute. Can you unmute yourself on your end and see if we can get audio?
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Listen,
but there's an echo, so you might want to wear a headset
How's this
instead
sound?
of. It sounds better. Thank you.
Okay. Are we good to go, Chris?
Can you hear me now?
Hey, Chris, we can hear you now.
As it happened, I was going to pause for a sip of water anyway on that slide, so that works. I'll keep moving though. I just wanted to note that from here forward, I'd like to shift away from the term scope work. At least in the presentation, we can come back to it later if we need to. But as staff noted in the proposal, this term scope work is actually pretty awkward in English. You know, it's actually an uncountable noun. Sorry for getting all linguistic on us, but that means that we can't really say something like 5 scope work. It just sounds really bizarre. It also is pretty close to the term scope of work. And so, as I mentioned, I feel like we feel like there could be a bit of confusion with those terms. So staff prefer the term risk reporting unit. And that was a concept that was also kind of presented to us from the contractor that was hired to develop concepts for phase 4. That's the level 4 contractor. I'm not sure if they're on the line today, but at any rate, yeah, so we do prefer this term risk reporting unit because it is countable and it integrates pretty well into discussions about RMR that we're going to have in December. And if possible, I kind of hope that we can all agree that the acronym should be pronounced RRU and not RRU, or certainly not RU. So hopefully, great, thank you, Matthew. So hopefully we can all agree that we'll just stick with RRU as the pronunciation. Okay, so the way SPD envisions the RRU is that it can be associated with a number of identifiers. Any RRU that shares a given identifier could be aggregated. So all of the risk reduction attributed to, for instance, a wildfire mitigation RRU that is all in tier 2 of the high fire threat districts, those could all be aggregated so that decision makers could determine how much risk reduction is achieved within tier 2 by this particular mitigation. We describe these points of aggregation as roll-up points. And I specifically call out the term scenario here, just to mention that, and that's because in the RMR staff proposal, we're going to be discussing the distinction between data about a mitigation that is forecasted, planned, and then the actual recorded data as an RRU is implemented. And so we'll talk about that more in December. And then I also wanted to mention, that it's possible data may change if there's an update to risk model versions. And so staff feel strongly that there needs to be more transparency around changes to risk model versions. And we can begin with how data is being reported within the RRU scale. And that will also be something that we discuss again in the RMR staff proposal. So these next slides are just kind of visualizing the way we see RRUs aggregating up to a risk event. So we can produce a view of risk reduction from mitigation programs for each risk event. And really, this is something that's already often done within utility work papers, where we see this granular level of information being aggregated up to a specific risk event, such as wildfire. So we can aggregate all of the granular data related to risk reduction for a certain mitigation within the wildfire context. And then we have a slightly more complicated example where each RRU would also contain the information for each of the 3 consequence attributes. So RRUs could also be aggregated to total safety, reliability, and financial consequences according to each of those 3 roll-up points. And this is slightly different than the unique identifiers, right? These are common data that's associated with all of the RRUs, including risk information. So it is possible to aggregate up to multiple attributes for these RRUs. So I think probably the most important discussion around the RRU or scope work is that we need to ensure that the level of granularity is appropriate to the risk and the mitigation used to reduce that risk. Setting the scope of an RRU to a finely granular level can be really beneficial in terms of how we aggregate data and the detailed analyses we can conduct. However, that also requires work to ensure the modeling and forecasts are backed by accurate data. And if the data is too granular, it makes it difficult for evaluators and parties to manage the data set. On the other hand, the whole purpose of the RRU is to disaggregate mitigation programs. So an RRU cannot be overly aggregated. There really is no point to creating an RRU that spans across multiple tranches or across multiple hierarchies, like multiple high fire threat district areas. Creating an overly aggregated RRU would make further aggregation pointless. Thus, this should be discouraged. And this is why staff spent time defining scope work, because we believe that those same principles are relevant to determining the proper granularity for an RRU. An RRU needs to have a distinct life cycle, and it needs to be both forward and backward looking. Hopefully, an RRU doesn't have a lifestyle. So part of the granularity picture can also be balanced by ensuring the right mapping of data to an RRU. Staff strongly encourage mapping of granular data to a single mitigation segment, from a single mitigation segment to a single RRU, and then that can be aggregated up to a mitigation program, or what we describe as a one-to-one mapping. And this ensures that the RRU can be properly aggregated up to various roll-up points, like risk events and tranches, and even the mitigation program itself. And the mitigation program is what's being depicted in this figure. The data associated with a given mitigation segment maps directly to a single RRU. So the undergrounding 1 segment maps to the RRU 1, and then the undergrounding 2 maps to RRU 3, but together they can be rolled up to the entire undergrounding program. And this becomes a bit messy when if a utility was intending to deploy a many-to-one approach to the RRU. For instance, carrying forward the previous figure, we can see that the mitigation segment covered conductor 1 and undergrounding 2 map to the same RRU. They map to RRU 2. So that would be these segments here mapping to RRU 2. And it would not be possible then to roll up RRU 2 to either the undergrounding or the covered conductor mitigation program level. Ultimately, the whole point of the RRU approach is undermined by a many-to-one approach. The utility would have to create 2 separate reporting structures, and that's really not the point of this staff proposal. We're trying to get greater clarity and transparency on this data. And we also want to point out why a one-to-many approach is discouraged. In the example depicted here, if RRU1 is reducing risk from both tranche 1 and tranche 2, how would an evaluator determine what portion of RRU1 is dedicated to tranche 1 versus tranche 2? So staff are concerned that a one-to-many approach may make it difficult to ensure the incrementality of costs. And then lastly, staff feel very strongly about the need for the utilities to maintain consistency in the granularity of RRUs from one GRC cycle to the next. Changes to granularity will make tracking the implementation of a GRC decision through an RMR report extremely difficult. if the utility does want to make a change to the granularity of the RRU from one GRC cycle to the next, it must explain the method for updating this granularity in its ramp and clarify how it improves upon the previous level or the previous level of granularity. Now, we expect that interveners and staff will also weigh in on such a change. Moreover, a utility must provide a backcast of post-mitigated risk reduction and benefit cost ratios from previous ramps and GRCs that are impacted by such an update to the RRU, the granularity of the RRU. And this will be very important within the context of the RMAR, as we'll discuss in December, because the utility must ensure an apples-to-apples comparison when they are providing data updates on the progress of their mitigation programs across GRC cycles. And in the next couple of slides, I'm just providing here to stimulate some discussion regarding the specific changes that the staff proposal is recommending be made to the RDF. This includes changes to the RDF structure, but also some additional definitions. So we have a couple of slides here to talk about changes directly to the rows within the RDF, and then a slide for discussing the definitions. And we're happy to take any questions on these added definitions and refined language to the RDF. And then later we can run through some discussion questions that I have. We can run through those perhaps after the break. And so for now, I went through that pretty quickly, but that's good. I really wanted to open this up to discussion primarily. And so I'm happy to take any questions and discuss any of your thoughts or concerns about this staff proposal.
Hi, this is Chris.
Hi, Chris. You have a really bad echo.
Chris, you're getting a really bad echo. If you could put on a headset, that would probably be optimal for this. That way we wouldn't give a feedback.
All right, I'm going to sign.
I'll give Chris a minute to jump back in. Any other questions from folks while Chris is working that out?
Hey Eddie, this is Miles Gordon from Cal Advocates. Had a question about getting to the granularity of the RRU. Is staff proposing any sort of approval process for the level of granularity, or will we just expect to see those in ramp or GRC applications?
Yeah, that's the location where we would be evaluating the RRU would be within a ramp application. And then, of course, that would be the same if they were making changes to the RRU. They would need to provide justification within the ramp for making those changes. And so there would be opportunity for parties and staff to make recommendations and suggestions about how that needs to change within a ramp evaluation. Sorry, Miles, did that help answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. And if that needs to be clarified in any of the discussions or within any of the changes that we're considering to the RDF, please, let us know. We can think about that. But I think in general, the RDF is the structure for filing a ramp proceeding, and then we make specific recommendations about how that, or the RDF also has very specific language about how that translates into the GRC. Yeah, Brian, go ahead.
Hey, thanks for just waiting for Chris to join a second here, but can you walk us through some of the logic and thinking behind some of these, some of this language here? It seems very specific and just want to hear your thoughts.
Okay, yeah, sure. I mean, we've already gone through most of the discussion about traceable. If you'd like, we can go back up to the slide that talks about the individual, pieces within the life cycle. But yeah, essentially, we see it as, when the utility explains what the granularity of the risk reporting unit is, they should provide us with an explanation of what the stage, what the different activity, what type of different activities are happening within each of the stages that are listed here within that life cycle. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think the question becomes, and maybe where we're struggling with it here is, how do you foresee this, working with non sort of asset-based activities, or activities that would be purely hypothetical, even to the first test year?
Hypothetical in the sense that you're unable to determine
A specific scope. That's right.
Yeah, that's something that I think we can definitely ask a question about. We should probably hear some suggestions about how to address that in the comment period. I believe that it should still be possible because in most of the ramps that we've received, even the non-asset based mitigations we're still receiving information about them. You guys are still providing information about them out to the third post-test year in a ramp submission. And so I agree that there may be some concern about how do you define like the scope out to the third test year for those non-asset based types of mitigations. And so we would appreciate hearing any type of suggestions in terms of language adjustments that need to be made for that. And I'm assuming that you're referring to things that are associated with like trainings for like cybersecurity or trainings that are associated with like employee safety and things like that. Is that correct?
That's right, Eddie. And there's others, but I appreciate you putting the non-wildfire lens on it. But even wildfire, right? There's things like our aerial suppression. There's other mitigations out there that may not be possible.
Great.
I actually, I know that we're going to talk a lot about wildfire, and I know that we have time for comments, but I do want to just preview what we see as a major hurdle to this framework, which is even for asset-based wildfire programs. I mean, the two most prominent ones are covered conductor and tug. The utilities 6 years before the third test year, right? That's when you file a ramp, 5 or 6 years.
Yep.
The scope of that work that the utilities put forth is a modeled scope.
I think there's quite a bit of echo from folks at SCE.
Yeah, I don't think.
I'm sorry, this is Jacob from CPU-CAT. Chris, are you having any luck finding a headset to wear?
Yeah, I'm actually just not getting audio to work, so I'm going to stay silent.
Okay.
So if I could just finish.
Please.
There is a modeled scope of work for covered conductor and tug. There is not a project scope of work for covered conductor and tug in the outer years. And I think there may be a little bit of a misconception of what happened in our last GRC. What happened in our last GRC is that through the litigated process, interveners, including Turn and Cal Advocates and MGRA, said, we understand your theoretical modeled scope of work. We want to know what specific projects you're going to do. And we said that is a legitimate discovery question. Sitting here in time, now a year and a half since we filed the ramp, we do have a physical scope of work for some of the projects up through maybe like 26-ish. Our GRC period is 25 through 28. And we provided that information like at that moment in time. I don't want us to be unrealistic about the forecasting abilities of the utilities. And I think there's this inverse relationship between granularity and reality. And the more granular you get, the more hypothetical in some cases that scope of work might be.
So I think, Brian, you still have your hand up, but did you want to comment on what Russell said? Or?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. My hand was still up. That's an artifact.
Yep, no problem. So I do want to hear from some of the other folks that are on this call regarding that particular issue. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Mitchell.
Yes, I just wanted to support what SE just said. We had noticed with if when the granularity gets too fine, that the statistical meaning of that granularity goes to zero. So I think one of the reasonability criteria for an RRU is that it has to be large enough to be statistically meaningful.
Great. And would we be able to provide some language on that in terms of what we mean by statistically meaningful? Oh, sorry, Dr. Mitchell, you're muted.
Sorry, I think that's going to be really domain dependent. I think it's something that you will know when you see it. Probably the criteria is sensitivity to reasonable to uncertainty. So if you vary it by the amount of uncertainty you know you have, if the results vary by a huge amount, then that would no longer be statistically meaningful.
So essentially, within a RAMP application, the utility would need to provide, a sensitivity analysis.
Yeah, not for, I mean, because it could be, hundreds or thousands of these things. This could be kind of off the cuff and just show what the utility itself should show reasonability that the range of uncertainty in this RRU still renders the result meaningful, and that will help set the scope of how big these things should be.
And could the utility actually provide the results of that sensitivity analysis? They could say, if the RRU was this granularity, here's how much uncertainty we would have, and that doesn't make sense. And they could provide like 3 options, for instance.
Yeah, and I don't think that has to be a huge calculation. That can sort of be qualitative demonstration versus quantitative. You don't want to generate excess work here.
Sure.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that. I agree with Dr. Mitchell here. I think, it's going to depend on what the risk is a little bit. If we have one mitigation, right? Anything is statistically significant. So I wouldn't want to just provide sensitivities just to provide sensitivities. But I take that point, and I think at Edison, that's sort of where we're thinking here, is that it's going to be really domain specific. And as you pointed out here, there has to be some flexibility for it to change over time, because it could change over time depending on even new technology, right? So just some thoughts on this slide.
So in terms of the granularity, the RRU is also mitigation specific, right? And so essentially that would mean that even if the technology changes, it would be necessary for the utility to come up with the appropriate RRU for that new mitigation technology that's invented. So Brian, are you saying that if the technology changes so much, it may require the scale or the granularity of the RRU of other technologies to adapt and change?
It could, right? So, and I'm thinking again, not just physical assets, right? But there's cyber assets. There's all sorts of different risks out there.
Okay, and so go ahead.
Yeah, and additionally, in support of that, I'd also say that it's not just technical changes. It's, everybody's coming up with this stuff on the first time. Not everything's going to be right. So from GRC to GRC, there should be traceability of RRUs, but not necessarily a one-to-one mapping. So you could just find out that your RRUs are actually too granular, especially now that you know more or are redefining some things. So you need to sort of aggregate them into an RRU, or conversely, it's getting too varied. You're representing multiple concepts within the same RRU, so you should split them apart.
Okay.
And,
well,
there should be traceability, but it doesn't have to be one-to-one.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Vincent.
Sorry, I'm trying to raise my hand here on this WebEx, but I'm not able to do so. Sorry to barge in. but yeah, I do have the same. We do have the same concerns that Dr. Mitchell has. That go further out in time. What we can forecast on third post-test year, which is perhaps up to 7 years out, right? It just gets a bit. There's a huge lot of uncertainty using the language that Dr. Mitchell is using. There's going to be a huge lot of uncertainty, and that really makes the applicability of doing that kind of work questionable. I'm also kind of curious. I think you mentioned that you had worked with L4V to come up with this RRU kind of concept, kind of definition. I'm curious to know from L4V as well whether this is a concept, a definition that was developed internally, or is something that has been adopted from other industries or other places.
Yeah, actually, maybe that would be helpful, Matthew, for you to speak to real quick. But I also want to point out, Matthew's, point that he just made in the chat, that it's always much easier to combine RRUs than it is to divide them in terms of traceability. So starting off granular may be the best approach. Does that make sense to you, Matthew? Are you able to unmute yourself, Matthew? Seems like he might have difficulty unmuting.
Matthew, this is Jacob from CPU CIT. You can select which microphone your audio is using if you go into the audio options and click the caret next to the microphone, the mute button, and then select the correct microphone path for you.
Maybe I can start him off. Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a different version of the same device, so whatever. Okay. First of all, these comments that we've been are right on. The idea that, especially if you're submitting a forecast for programs that go out, 7, 8, 9 years. Well, as they say, forecasting is hard, especially the future, and doing very granular forecasts is even harder. So these are the kind of things that we will have to think about, is what level of granularity. And I would expect that for different types of risks and different types of mitigations, the RRU granularity may be different. There should be that kind of flexibility. Now, to answer the specific question, where does this all come from? The RRU is very much rooted in the principles of financial reporting, because ultimately that's what this is. This is financial reporting for risk, costs, and benefits. And there are many decades of experience on how to do this and how to do it properly, how to be auditable, how to avoid double counting, how to avoid leaving things out. And that's where these principles are coming from. There's no reason to come up with a brand new way of doing it. The financial reporting principle is very applicable and, very well tested through decades and decades and decades.
So
I just want to say I thought so. This RRU sounds a lot like a risk accountability unit or something, which you've seen in these past experiences in finance, right? And I just want to point out, in the finance world, they have different concepts out there, like risk budgeting and all kinds of stuff. But basically, there's finance. I think they're kind of comfortable with the idea that RRUs can evolve over time, right? Like, when you're talking about the future, one example you have when you're talking about the future is like, oh, you have an investment strategy. The investment strategy is buy 30% bonds or whatever, or 40% stocks, whatever. You don't go and actually figure out, I'm going to buy Google, I'm going to buy Apple, you're going to buy 30% stocks. And then after the fact, when you're doing your accountability, after the fact, you can go in at a later time and see, well, actually, did you buy those stocks that have the risk characteristics that you you're looking for, right? So there's this idea of like, in the forecasting in the future. I think it also goes to Dr. Mitchell's point, which is basically like, that level of granularity for forecasting in the future. I think it can work at odds with what you're trying to accomplish. You want to know at a certain level, at a plan level, at a program level, like what is it we're trying to accomplish, but the actual details can be verified at a later stage. I think that's the approach that I've seen a lot in finance. You're right. I think it works well, and I think it plays to both kinds of things that we're trying to do. We want the accountability, but at the same time, we don't want to overburden ourselves with a lot of data that has really a lot of uncertainty in them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we agree with that, and that's why this is the level of granularity, the Goldilocks approach, has to be worked out, and it could be different depending on the risk and the mitigation.
Maybe one additional thing. Sorry, Dan, I see that you have your hand up, and I'll come back to it in a minute. But I think one of the other things that what I'm hearing the concern is about the limitations to being able to forecast out to the third post-test year within a RAMP application. But that in a GRC application that may be easier to accomplish. And so perhaps within a RAMP application at this level of granularity, the utility should be required to provide up to a certain amount at this level of granularity. But with the understanding that those are estimates. The third post-test year at this level of granularity would simply be estimates, and that they would change as you move into the GRC process. And I think that some of that may also be resolved by some of the reporting processes that we're envisioning for things like RMR and for the data templates that we're going to be talking about in January. So with the idea that the utility can update this information as time goes on, would that kind of alleviate some of these issues? And then let's see, Dan, did you want to go ahead and ask your question first?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to bring up a point I think that Brian had brought up earlier. When you look at A, traceable through all stages of a life cycle, including but not limited to, the four that are listed there. Those obviously seem very specific to, like T&D or physical asset based. But once again, for programs like aerial suppression, employee training, they simply do not fit that type of a framework. And so it's the intent that if a control or mitigation simply doesn't have this, that is acceptable to not necessarily have an RRU. And then once again, we provide the analysis at a tranche level or a program level. It just seems like it would be extremely difficult or near impossible to fit every control or mitigation into the framework of an ABCD here.
Right. So I think B and C should be possible regardless of whether or not it's a asset-based or a non-asset-based mitigation. That I don't. You would have to provide me a little bit more context in order for me to understand what you mean by that. As far as A is concerned, though, wouldn't it be possible to at least disaggregate a program like aerial suppression and but maybe not all of these stages are necessarily relevant to that. For instance, obviously post-construction is not relevant to something like cybersecurity training. So it could include, but it's not limited to those particular stages. And if we need to change some of the language around that, I think I'm happy to entertain that idea.
I mean, I think for like an aerial suppression, yes, we forecast out, in the years, but it's a forecast based on contracts, and then obviously the helicopters are deployed. It's just, it's not clear how or why we would need to include the stages of the aerial suppression program.
Sure. And I think that those could be like, there could be a justification within your ramp application that says like why we don't, discuss in detail each of these life cycle stages for something like aerial suppression.
Hey, Eddie, just to build on that a little bit, I don't even think we would be able to define the risk reporting unit here for aerial suppression, for instance. It would be at a program level itself. So that's where it becomes problematic in and of itself. Just building upon what where Vincent was going to go is, I also realized that this, or suspected this came from sort of the financial world. So would it be more appropriate to understand what your tranche is or how your tranche is performing in terms of your whole portfolio rather than each individual stock and bond? So I had that same sort of concern here when Vincent brought it up, it just sort of opened the door here.
So I think just to make sure, the way that you're using tranche there is slightly different than the way that we use tranche in this context, correct?
It could be.
My point is that within the RDF, the way that the tranches are designed, they're designed based off of a very particular definition for this context. But I think the way that you're thinking of tranches is a collection of bonds that have a specific risk level. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. So if I'm looking at something that's going to give me a return, let's say it's a risk return, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the intent here is to trace back the amount of risk return that I'm getting per unit of mitigation, which I think is the concept here. It's really not each individual asset you really want to know, but really the portfolio of assets. And I think that's where it becomes concerning, is that the more granular you become and the more complexity is built in and the less traceable it is or certain it is over time. So
right.
I just want to bring that concept up because some of these things, while they seem good on paper, when we think about implementing them for like aerial suppression, like what's the risk reporting unit? I don't know. It's not in each individual helicopter because it's there only, it's a hypothetical contract, right? It's there only if we need it. That's just one example, but antivirus software, employee training. So there's some really concerning implementation issues we have here, and we just want everyone to consider that.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, Matthew, did you have something that you wanted to add to that?
Yes. So, I think that what we should do is, it's very reasonable that there are certain types of actions or mitigation events here that don't fall into the same kind of granularity concept, and we've talked about a couple. There are ways to handle that in a higher level portfolio grouping, as Brian mentioned, and we should collect those examples, and then Eddie, it becomes important for the commission to think about, well, what kind of accountability does it want? Because maybe you saying, well, for aerial suppression, we're not going to do a project by project or type of review, which is written into some of the language. That for those, we understand that it's we're going to look at the program as a whole, and you get that it's most of the things that we do can be done at this kind of disaggregated RRU level. There might be some things that are kind of program level or top of the house level things, but those should be easily identifiable, and you can handle them as long as the commission then isn't going to start asking the utility saying, well, we want to see what your plan was by project, because there wasn't one. So you just have to have build in an understanding of how the evaluation of aerial suppression would be, as opposed to looking at covered conductor by circuit.
Sure. And actually, Brian, sorry to interrupt real quick. I just wanted to maybe ping folks from Cal Advocates real quick if they had any thoughts about this. Sometimes I think Cal Advocates perhaps has done evaluations over things like contracts related to aerial suppression. And I wanted to see if folks on your end have any suggestions about how we might be able to structure language around this. So if anyone on the the Cal Advocates team has thoughts about that, please raise your hand. But Brian, if you wanted to jump in real quick while they're thinking about that, please go ahead.
No, I appreciate that. I think the last point I'll make is that, we have to consider the scope of this because it says everything, right? So there may be a threshold, and I don't know if it's financial, I don't know if it's the size of the program, but it may not be reasonable to have this for every single program in mitigation because, there are some very small programs that we have that the reporting may be more burdensome than the amount of money we're spending in the program, if that makes sense. So we'd have to consider about which programs that we're sticking specifically, but we're happy to provide a list of the programs we think this is maybe reasonable or not reasonable to enact. So.
And maybe, oh, go ahead. Yeah, Chris.
Okay, I unmuted myself. Yeah, so we wouldn't be able to talk about aerial suppression or something like that at this time. I do think, though, that one of the key benefits of the risk reporting unit in those type of programs is to give the information that the commission can use then to be able to judge, what level of funding is appropriate for this type of mitigation. So I think that my understanding of the risk reporting unit provides kind of like a basis, a start. And so to the extent that it can be applied to a variety of different mitigation measures, to kind of understand, what is the risk reduction, what is the benefit, and then be able to have more than just, a basic concept. Well, this does this. I mean, if we're talking about aerial suppression, and I heard a discussion about helicopters or air, air assets, then, having some basis to understand why it should be that level and not half that level, or so on. So I do think that there is some value to the extent it can be applied to a variety of programs.
I think I saw both Vincent and Dr. Mitchell.
Yeah, I think that a really simple abstraction that would solve this would be that for every program, there is a minimum unit of definable risk. So for the aerial suppression, you can't really divide it into anything. If it's a covered conductor program, that can be divided into individual circuit segments. So there is a smallest possible atomic level of risk that can be associated with the program. That gets defined along with the program. And then the goal is to divide up your RRUs according to each of those. As far as practicality goes, statistical significance, and all the other considerations that go into determining your RRU size.
Yeah, so essentially the utility would just need to present to us what is the minimum unit of risk reduction that's achievable by this particular program. If it's the entire program, then perhaps so be it.
Right.
And then,
Yeah,
go ahead, Vincent.
I just want to caveat that, right? The minimum level of risk that can be reportable will change as we go out further in time, right? That's what we're talking about here. Maybe it's easier to forecast, at a certain level when you're closer, when you're talking about what you want to do next year. But as you go out further in time, I think that the ability to do that kind of forecasting is going to be challenging. So that's just one thing I wanted to bring up as well.
Yeah, I think that's something that's at least, it's debatable. I think it's something that what you just mentioned, Vincent, is something that parties could weigh in on, and data requests could try to uncover, what is the minimum amount of risk that can be reported at the third post-test year, for instance. So, Yeah, I think that what Dr. Mitchell has suggested is at least something that can kind of get the conversation started, if that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, I do want to be mindful of the time, and so I think I want us to go ahead and try to take a break and then come back. Oh, you know what? I have 15 more minutes. How about we go ahead and continue some of this conversation, and we'll take a break in 15 minutes. Sorry to interrupt everybody's thoughts. Yeah, Joel, go ahead. Sorry, we're having difficulty hearing you, Joel. And if we need to switch to Teams for these meetings in the future.
Jalal, this is Jacob from CPU CIT. If you just go ahead and go to the mute button, and there's a caret next to it that will open up the audio options. You can see what microphone you have selected right there, and you can choose which one you want to use.
And I'll just speak very selfishly. If the commission moved to Teams, you would make my life so much easier.
Thanks, Russell.
I agree with that last part. Can you hear me now, Eddie?
Yes, go ahead, Joel. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm fairly new to this, so my questions might be very basic to most of you here. But I'm wondering on a very basic level, so the concept of an RRU is each RRU has 3 attributes: safety, financial, and reliability. And ideally those map one-on-one with mitigations or controls. So I'm looking at slide 18.
Yeah, just to clarify, risk is made up of these 3 attributes. And so risk is made up of the safety consequence, reliability consequence, and the financial consequence. And so the RRUs are able to reduce risk, and therefore they may have the ability to reduce a safety risk, or they may have the ability to reduce a reliability risk or a financial risk. They also can reduce the likelihood of a risk event. And so, yeah, it depends on the mitigation itself. And that's how you would aggregate this information up.
Right, thank you. So with that definition, if we look at slide 18, on the undergrounding and covered conductor RRUs, one of the challenges that we had in our review of the RAMP application was
which RAMP application?
The 2024 PG&E RAMP was kind of cross comparison between mitigation specifically, but also controls in terms of looking at how, for example, different mitigations would compare on a benefit cost basis. So does this concept of RRUs address some of that? We had a comparative spreadsheet from PG&E, which was very useful for comparing undergrounding and covered conductor on a tranche level, but does this concept of RRUs address some of those cross comparison challenges?
So what the RRU would do is allow you to roll up to the tranche level if you wanted to. Essentially, these RRUs could be aggregated at the tranche level as well, and so you could aggregate according to both the mitigation type and the tranche type. So actually, it's quite similar to what the utilities have presented in some cases, although you know, it would require PG&E, I believe, would need to provide a disaggregation of their mitigation programs and then roll them up to the tranche level in this particular instance. And I'm not entirely certain that was done in the 2024 ramp for the wildfire mitigations that you're describing.
Right, but yeah, we did have analysis at the circuit segment level for undergrounding and covered conductors. So I think that would be useful if that is one application of RRUs. And my second comment was on the controls versus mitigations. So there could be some controls that effectively reduce the pre-mitigation risk. And I was wondering if it would be possible for RRUs to capture that. Sorry.
So if my understanding is that controls maintain risk before mitigations are implemented, essentially. So they maintain risk at a certain level, and that's consistent. The whole point of controls is that you try to fund the controls so that it maintains the risk at a specific level before you also begin to add in mitigations. And yeah, I think I don't see why that wouldn't be the case within an RRU framework. It would just be asking the utility to disaggregate the program level of a control to a smaller level, which is the RRU.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, Vincent, go ahead. I see your hand up.
We want to point out that you mentioned in your
Vincent, we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah,
Hello?
it's a little fuzzy, but
oh,
better.
Sorry. Just speak louder then. I was saying that while we're talking about RRUs in general, right? I mean, you've made some statements about what you'd like RRUs to be. You kind of highly discourage one-to-many kind of RRUs. Just want to point out we have cross-cutting risk. We have mitigations for those cross-cutting risks. Some of our underground programs obviously mitigate, distribution overhead risk as well. So that kind of, might not be able to get away from this one-to-many. And then if that does happen, what are the effects on what you intend to do with these risk reporting? How does it impact what your designs are?
Yeah, I mean, so we do definitely discourage what you're describing there, Vincent. I don't have a slide that actually looks specifically at what you're talking about, but I mean, they're definitely, we understand that there are cross-cutting risks. In fact, one of the other pieces of the level 4 contract that we're working on is discussing interrelated risks. But we weren't able to integrate that into this phase. But I believe that it should probably be possible for you to distinguish the RRU so that it can address, could address multiple risks, but you would need to be able to describe very clearly how each RRU is addressing that risk, because you want to make sure that if you're generating, say, like a cost benefit or a benefit cost ratio for an investment that is going to be reducing both wildfire and hydropower risk, it just needs to be made very clearly how that is done, because I think the crux of it there is the costs are only going to be borne by ratepayers once, but you're going to be reducing risk essentially twice in two different locations. So that, I think, has to be made very clear, within that particular, if you're going to be defining the granularity for that particular mitigation, you're going to have to explain that the cost of this particular mitigation is only going to be borne once, even though, we're going to be looking at the benefits of that in two different places. Does that make sense?
I hear what you're getting at, but I think, it's one of those things, like you mentioned has to make very clear. I mean, what does that what do you mean by very clear, right? So I think we probably need to try this out and see if it works or get, a little bit more guidance. So it kind of goes to what I think you're kind of thinking about, right? What are the ultimate objectives that we want to accomplish with these RRUs? And, I think having that statement up front, will help us to, give you the feedback that I think can help all of us get to that, so achieve those objectives.
Well, I think,
I
think the goal of the RRU is pretty obvious, that, the program level reporting hasn't been able to get the level of transparency and accountability that we've been requesting from the utilities in our evaluations. And, I think that's already pretty apparent. At any rate, I think Matthew had his hand up, and maybe he can actually also address your concern about the interrelatedness of these different types of mitigations.
Right. Yeah, I would think of this as not so much as a cross-cutting risk but as cross-cutting mitigation. So what happens when a single mitigation, affects, let's say, transmission and distribution? There are one thing you would consider doing is actually make two RRUs, one that points the mitigation benefit to the transmission and another that points the mitigation benefit to the distribution piece. Then you're stuck with the issue of the costs, because you don't want to double count the costs. And the simplest way that is done is do a fairly arbitrary cost allocation between the two, and saying, we're just going to allocate half the costs to each, or if there's a better way of doing it. But the minute you have the one-to-many mapping, then you're dead on aggregation. It cannot be done. So you have to come up with ways. One is what I've done is basically I have two RRUs that point to each of the two different risks and go from there. But really, that's one of the key learnings, and through decades of financial reporting, and all of us have gone through the awful pain of having the one-to-many and then going back and trying to figure things out. It causes tremendous pain, and we might as well avoid that as much as possible up front.
Brian, I see that you had your hand up.
Yeah.
And I actually wanted to address something that Dr. Mitchell put in the chat, actually.
Yeah, so just building upon that a little bit too. I mean, there's also, I'm going to pick on PSPS and wildfire, right? So there's and also contact with energized, right? Cover conductor can address that. Undergrounding can address that. That's many different risks altogether. I don't know if proportionally allocating the costs, even though we can proportionally allocate the risks, would actually, we need some guidance on that. And I don't know if it actually gets to that transparency, because here's my thought. We may pick one different mitigation for each one of those, but it may not be the whole portfolio that's most cost effective for all of them. So I think it becomes confusing at that point. And I want to just make sure we're cost effective, right? So that's
right. But if you were at the proper level of granularity for, essentially the asset is the same, right? The asset is going to be shared by all of those risks, correct?
That's right.
Yeah. So the asset could help you define what the granularity of the RRU is. That's step one.
I agree, but then we'd have to have 3 RRUs, one for each risk. Is that right?
Yes, essentially that's what you could do. And then why wouldn't you be able to apportion the cost according to the amount of risk that you know that mitigation is able to reduce for that particular asset. And if you think of it in terms of a portfolio approach, then you would be able to kind of look at the overall risk reduction within that portfolio and apportion the cost based off of the apportionment, based off the amount of risk reduction that's being achieved by that particular mitigation.
So disagree with that. I just want to point out that the cost allocation you're making is kind of arbitrary, right? So it's like
It is.
But the thing that's important is that you need to look at it across all the different as a unit, right? As an entity, it's not just reducing the risk of wildfire; it's the whole entity, right? So the risk is not the kind of the risk is that you look at it separately and you say, oh, you break into 3 RRU. Oh, by the way, RRU 3 doesn't look great. It's like, why does RRU 3 doesn't look great? Well, because we arbitrarily broke up the cost. So it's like, you really need to look at it at that for cross-cutting risk, for the risk that Brian pointed out, You really need to look at it across the different risks, across the different.
Vincent, before I let Matthew and Dr. Mitchell join in here, doesn't this problem already exist with the program level? Why would this be any different at the program level than if you disaggregated the programs?
I think we're just trying to point out that we're adding more of this, adding more to this problem, right? At RRU level.
So the problem already exists, and you guys actually don't have a solution for this at the program level, and so it would be even more complicated to deal with if you were going to disaggregate the program, essentially.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. Let's see, Dr. Mitchell, I think you had your hand up first, but was it related to this particular topic?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is, I think it's, I'm a little confused too. And I think maybe just working through one very simple example will help here. And that is take a circuit segment. It's going to be undergrounded. That's part of a program. That's going to mitigate PSPS. And that's going to mitigate wildfire ignition. Okay. There is one cost. There's actually no reason to divide that arbitrarily between PSPS. I mean, PSPS has its own implementation costs for a program at the program level, but at the risk mitigation level, undergrounding also addresses PSPS risk as a specific thing. So I think that the mitigation program itself is sort of atomic, and the abstraction that has to map onto it can point to that cost, but you could have multiple risks mitigated by a single mitigation. So I don't think doing a hard, requiring that your RRUs have a cost associated with that element itself is a correct abstraction. I think the costs, if I understand them, are associated with the program. That seems to be indivisible. And the elements of the program, that seems to be indivisible. And then the RRU would just point to that. And you could have multiple RRUs addressing different risks, but having the same cost. They're pulling from the same cost pool. Does that make sense?
I think so, but I'll let Matthew jump in here because
Joe, I like your way of coming up with examples and trying to come up with principles. And in that spirit, for the example that you gave, the principle is for wherever you need to or required to calculate a CBR or a BCR, benefit cost ratio, then you have to have the cost information for that. So in your example, if you didn't need to calculate a BCR for the PSPS piece, then I would agree, don't allocate the cost. But if you did, then you have no choice because you cannot do it without
not
the cost
quite,
allocation.
because it's not that you don't have a cost. It's that the cost is not a feature of an element. It's actually pointed to. So we're talking about the specific segment that's going to be undergrounded and you're going to have a BCR for PSPS risk reduction, and you're going to have a BCR for the wildfire risk reduction. Those are different BCRs. Those are tied to, so the BCR is tied to the RRU, but the cost is not. The cost is pulled from the cost calculated for that element in the program. Does that make
Joe,
sense?
no, you just contradicted yourself because the cost, in order to calculate the BCR, the C is the cost. So if you do not have the cost, there is no BCR.
No. You have a pointer to the cost. The cost. So it's actually a many-to-one relationship on cost. That's actually the correct abstraction, because one cost addresses many risks.
Trust me, as a CFO for 25 years, that just doesn't compute, because I'll give you a numerical example. You have, the benefit of the cost that goes to the two units, the PSPS and the wildfire, is 2. And the benefit for each of those is 1.5. If you then look at 1.5 to 2, both of them look negative, but the actual is 3 to 2, which is positive. It doesn't work. Now, if you're going to say, well, you don't have to do the BCR for PSPS, then you're resolved there. But at any unit that you need to calculate a BCR, you will then have to have a cost for the denominator. It's inescapable.
Right, but I think that if you're looking at an aggregated BCR, so total, okay, so there is BCRs can be aggregated. So you would have an elemental BCR for each risk reduced. Say that you weren't calculating PSPS, like back in the good old days, you weren't even doing PSPS risk calculations for a circuit element. Now you do. Now, before that, the cost of mitigating doesn't change. So if you're only reducing wildfire, then your BCR for reducing wildfire is exactly equal to your BCR for the undergrounding program for that element. They're completely identical. But if you now are addressing additional risks with the same mitigation, either because you now are doing the calculation and you weren't before, or you realize there's a new risk that this is mitigating that you hadn't thought of, so each of those will have its individual BCR associated with the RRU, because the risk is different for each of those RRUs. But the overall risk reduction is the aggregate, the BCR for all three of those, okay? Because the cost is identical for the PSPS reduction and the undergrounding. It's the same cost. You don't.
No, I feel like I think we're going to have to, we won't be able to solve this without some numerical examples. Brian also sort of pointed out this, saying at the end of the day, we want to be looking at this at a portfolio basis, and we wholeheartedly agree. And the principle of the risk reporting unit is that, well, they should aggregate up to the portfolios properly. And that, I think, is the most important piece. Where it gets tricky is for evaluators who say, well, I want to look at the individual pieces of the portfolios. And that's kind of what we're struggling with here, is because as you say, well, I want to be able to look at more and more aggregated pieces, down to the program or project or circuit segment level, that's when you need to have at that level good estimates of the benefits and good estimates of the cost, or you can't do it. And I think there's, in some cases, where we would look at saying, we probably shouldn't look at it at that level. It just doesn't make sense, either statistically or other reasons. We don't want to do arbitrary cost allocations. Those, I think, need to be part of the conversation. You know, at what level do we want to be able to calculate granular BCRs?
Yeah.
And if we say that we don't really want to go down to that level, then a lot of these problems go away.
No, I think actually you solve your problem by attaching a BCR to each of your RRUs at the granular level, because you're actually doing that in your calculations anyway. You're actually calculating, you don't have to do additional calculations beyond anything you're doing now. It's just how you put all those numbers together. So for instance, this concept I just gave you of the sort of RRU being associated with an atomic level of cost benefit ratio, you can aggregate that on both axes. You can say from the program level, how much, what is my CBR for the entire PSPS mitigation program? And you can sum up the amount of risk reduced, sum up the amount of cost, and that gives you a CBR level for the entire program. In the other direction, you can say, what is my CBR for this circuit from all of my programs? And so you can sum up the CBR for your PSPS on the circuit, PSPS reduction, and your wildfire reduction CBR for that. So it becomes, it's atomic at that level. So I think that, you can do it either way. I think you don't want to, I don't think we're adding any work for anybody here. It's just how you attach, where you attach the numbers in what element of a database.
I want to give us a break actually before we continue. I know that there's still a lot to say on both of these topics. Fred, did you want to make some last word on this point, and we'll come back to it? Or
yeah, thanks very much, Eddie. Hi, everyone.
And you're very faint, Fred.
Okay, let me try to get closer to my mic. So it's kind of related to what we're seeing that an approach PG&E took in the current PG&E ramp, where they, for instance, they said, hey, we've got a grid hardening program. We're going to do a bunch of undergrounding and it's going to reduce wildfire risk. But then they said, you know what? There's also going to be risk benefit to things like the distribution overhead risk, which looks at the kind of risk that can happen outside of ignitions, that can happen from, downed wires and things like that. And they say, you know what, there's also benefit to reducing the risk of this separate risk we define, the overhead distribution risk. But when they present the CBR in each of those different risk chapters, they basically just said, this is our total CBR considering all the things that are going to happen with this undergrounding. And in order and they only present it, they don't present it disaggregated in the ramp, but we dove into the work papers and we saw there were separate calculations of like what the CBR was for distribution overhead, assuming that they spent the some $1 billion on doing that undergrounding program, and what's the incremental benefit they got from just the distribution overhead risk. And if you look at that separately, it's not a very compelling cost benefit ratio. But the point is that they were going to spend that money anyway on undergrounding to solve the wildfire problem. And so what you're getting from distribution overhead is just kind of a bonus. It's like a bonus additional risk reduction that improves the overall program CBR. So I think that's kind of like a sidebar related to this conversation that we're having about how to approach these things. I just kind of wanted to throw that in there. We're making that observation in the current ramp.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, that like if we were looking at this at the portfolio level, then that risk reduction would be calculated at the portfolio level for all of the risk benefit that's achieved for each of those risks. And maybe, Vincent, if you could, let's take like a 5 to 10 minute break. I think maybe just maybe a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 11:35, and we'll kind of continue this conversation and hopefully get to some of the other questions that are in the slide deck. And so we'll be right back. Does that sound good, Vincent?
I'm not going to hold everybody up on the break. So
Thank you. All right, be right back.
This is Chris.
Chris, this is Jacob from CPU CIT. What can I help you with?
Chatter. Thanks, Jacob. Let's see. Vincent, did you have your, it looks like you lowered your hand. So I do kind of want to transition us to some of the other questions that are in the slide deck. I think we've kind of hashed through this issue of interrelatedness to quite some degree, and it may be that we're going to have more discussion of that within the comment period. But I also want to point out that, you know, in the risk tolerance proposal, we will also be having a discussion about portfolios, and some of that, you know, may be clarified once we get to that discussion in November. So I think if we need to, we can come back to some of this extra language, but I wanted to see if we could kind of move on to some of the other questions that are here. And some of them I think that we've kind of discussed a bit already. You know, part of this I think that we're discussing is, do we need to provide guidance in terms of whether or not the RRU or the scope work is overly aggregated? And I think that I've heard that, you know, there does need to be some guidance, and even the utilities have asked for that. And so I just wanted to see if there's any additional questions or thoughts about granularity and the type of guidance that's needed for that. Or do we need to give folks a little bit more time to come back?
Hey, hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, hey, this is Miles from Kyle Advocates. Sorry, I was just got back to my desk. I would just emphasize that I think to the extent possible, we want them to be at the level that work is actually scoped, which might not even necessarily be the most granular unit of measurement. I mean, for example, with undergrounding, is like you can disaggregate to a circuit segment level, but then those circuit segments get rolled up into projects. And so the circuit segment level might not actually be the most useful unit of measurement. And so I just wanted to emphasize that.
So I think actually the suggestion that Dr. Mitchell had kind of addresses this, right? Essentially, the minimum unit of risk reduction that's achieved is kind of this, you know, that smallest level of risk reduction is the appropriate you know, position for where granularity should fit. And so, and of course, that also opens it up to debate. You know, the utilities may say that the minimum amount of risk reduction that can be scoped out is X, and a party could challenge that, and there could be, you know, discussion about how that should be, you know, yeah, scoped out within a ramp, and then that could influence how the unit is actually structured within a GRC filing, and in reporting filings as well.
So Joe here, and Jalal raised a good point in the chat, and I responded to it. And basically, and he was saying basically, well, you know, you may want to have aggregated units as your RRUs, and so you know, that's fine. You could have a certain defined set of circuit segments, for instance, defined as your RRU. that's okay, but there's three criteria that has to meet. Number one, what I talked about at the beginning, which is sensitivity and uncertainty. You want that to be sort of robust and not too statistically small so that it's a very uncertain level. Likewise, I think there's a cost threshold as well. If it is, if it's, $100 mitigation, it may not even be worth considering, and that would go along with the mitigation applied to that. And third, in order to be able to have complete reconstructability on both axes, on the program and costs and mitigation level and on the risk reduction level, you have to have the same mitigations apply to your RRU, the same set. Otherwise, if you lose your traceability. So I think those are the three criteria for binning things together and using the bigger group as an RRU.
So I just wanted to make sure that I understand this though. The bigger group is still a disaggregation from the program itself. You're just saying that there's obviously there could be like a very, very refined level of granularity, but it may not make sense to actually set the RRU at that level of granularity. And you set it at that kind of meso level, and then if you needed to, you could disaggregate to those smaller particles or those smaller segments. But at least in terms of reporting to data templates and to the RMR and things like that, it makes sense to do it at that more meso level.
Yeah, an example is tranche. I mean, that's an artificial construct as well. And people divide things into tranches. Now, of course, the tranches have many different mitigations applied to them. So tranche doesn't really, it's way too coarse to actually use for RRUs because you're going to have PSPS, you're going to have all these different mitigations and different programs associated with those circuits. So it's kind of hard. But if you can just sort of reduce it so that you're not breaking any other abstraction, you can make it as big as you think it should be. And what the maximum size is, I don't have a real opinion on that. I think that's going to be down to what the CPUC and interveners and the utilities have to say about that.
Right, and I think that's kind of the point that we were getting at with regard to these different identifiers, is that the level of granularity for an RRU has to be defined by these unique identifiers, so that it obviously has to be able to be more granular than any of the unique identifiers, so that you can actually roll up to them. And so, and then I think what makes sense is that this idea of whatever the minimum unit of risk that can be reduced as the unit of analysis for that RRU, that tends to make sense.
Yeah, and you can always, there is a minimum, like the circuit segment, because that is as small as you could possibly make.
Right.
But you can make it significantly larger as long as you're not breaking your abstraction by having different mitigations apply to different circuits. So
exactly, as long as these unique identifiers aren't broken, then you can aggregate up even above the minimum unit of risk reduction.
Right.
All right. That's helpful. Thank you. I appreciate that. Vincent, I saw your hand go up slightly, but you took it down? Did you want to say something?
I was going to ask, but I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask anyway, was like, why are we seeing this slide? Yeah, why are we talking about version number, risk event? It's not relevant to the discussion, the workshop directly today, right? I mean, like, and is this some kind of requirement that's not written in the RDF right now, as in your proposed RDF?
The risk event? How is the risk event not
No,
into the RDF?
no. This RRU, this RRU, the thing that that you're showing in no, can you go back to that diagram?
Well,
please?
yeah, but I mean, Vincent, the whole point of the staff proposal that we wrote was to integrate the RRU into the RDF.
I see. So can you go back to that slide that you had there? So is this the one the box that you have in blue that is that a requirement going forward for RRUs? And if so, I haven't seen any language in your proposed definition.
So the language says that it needs to be able to be auditable and forecastable, and that it's a disaggregation of the program. If it makes more sense to very clearly outline what the unique identifiers we expect within the RRU, I believe that all 6 of these would definitely be, required within the RRU language. And so we can definitely add that. Because as you point out, that is not listed here, is essentially what your point is.
Yeah, I don't know why, and then so that begs the question of why would you want to have a scenario? I'm not even sure what scenario means. A version number. It's not.
So that's what we're going to be discussing more in detail in the ARMOR report.
Okay, so that definition is really tied to the ARM. Those items are really tied to
those
the ARM.
items are tied to the ARMOR. Yes.
Okay, so that being the case, we don't see a lot of. I don't know whether R and the R kind of objectives and R and the R requirements fit into the RDF, but it might be just that that need to show up separately somewhere else. Those.
Yep, I can definitely address that before we send off the proposal to the docket for comment. Great,
So
thank you for
going back to I think it's the previous slide.
Yes.
Let me move back to the slide. Yeah, these definitions. I'm just curious, right? Why do we need a definition for asset? And I looked at the definition that you provided in the proposal. I went to the book definition. It referenced something about electric plants. I read it. So it's like, why do we need this definition about asset?
No, the universal system of accounts is not just referenced. You have to scroll down further. It's actually a very long list, but it's something that's used, within pretty much any, I would say, any sort of cost recovery application, because the retirement unit of any type of asset is developed based off the FERC Energy Regulatory Commission uniform system of accounts, and so that's a system for defining assets so that you can actually define the depreciation curves for each of those assets. That's something that's structured by FERC specifically. So I'm almost certain that someone on your GRC team will be very familiar with that system of accounts.
But why do we need it in the RDF definition?
Well, it's just a point that there's a certain number of assets that are considered capital investments that have depreciation curves, and so the definition of program, was that it included, the definition of the risk reporting unit was that it would be a group of assets or systems that exhibit high levels of risk. And so we wanted to provide more clarity on what an asset actually is and what a system actually is. So that way there wouldn't be any ambiguity about, what should be included within a risk reporting unit. So the risk reporting unit could include a physical asset that's defined by the uniform system of accounts. And if it doesn't fit within that framework, then it should fit within the definition of system. Does that help answer your question, Vincent?
I think so. I just have to look through these definitions again. And also back to this, you talk about mitigation program. Is this similar to, there's a definition, I think, for mitigation and
No, no, the mitigation program definition, actually, it was never placed directly into the list of formal definitions in the RDF, but program actually is defined within row 28, and it's defined exactly this way. So all I've done is just suggested that we just move it into the formal definitions.
Okay. I thought there was a definition for, and I might be mistaken, but I thought there was some definition of what a mitigation and control is already.
There is a definition for mitigation and control. This would be the definition for mitigation program. And I think we should probably add like a slash, mitigation / control program. Or we could just define program if that would make it more clear.
Okay.
Yeah, because this already exists. It's already in the RDF. It's already in row 28, and so this would just make it more clear that
you're just trying to clarify really what the program is, right?
Yeah, because the term program it's going to be appearing much more in this language because we're going to be talking about disaggregating. The whole point of the RRU is to disaggregate the program level, and so we need to define what program is more clearly.
Okay.
Great. Let's see. Is there any other questions on that particular issue? If not, I think I feel like we have had quite a bit of discussion actually about granularity. And so I do kind of want to touch on a couple of other topics. And some of it kind of got brought up in the chat about the issue of contiguity, contiguousness. And, I think that one of the issues with contiguousness, and I think that, Jalal, you kind of mentioned it, is that, a risk reporting unit, the level of granularity, there is a certain amount of logic to making sure that the assets are contiguous and connected to each other. But that could also result in a large number of risk reporting units. And, you could also make the argument, or the question is there an argument for allowing discontiguous, assets to be, aggregated up to the risk reporting unit level? And that way and I think that to a certain extent, that's kind of what Dr. Mitchell was referring to with maybe there is like a meso level, but in order to meet that medium level, you may need to have assets that are not necessarily touching each other, not necessarily connected to each other. And I wanted to hear if there was some thoughts about that.
So Eddie, this is Russell. I assume implicitly here, this would be only for asset-based risks, right? Because non-asset-based risks are not geographical in nature, so they're not contiguous or non-contiguous.
That's correct.
That was pretty obvious. Sorry for stating the obvious. But as far as asset-based risks, I think when you scope a project, we've talked a lot about projects, then those projects for many of the programs that we're talking about will tend to be contiguous with each other. Think about a covered conductor project will be circuit segments that are physically attached to each other. Same with an undergrounding project. There could be other types of projects that may not fit this definition, interested in others' thoughts. But I think that these are useful concepts to think about on the asset-based class or asset-based risks. I just haven't thought through sort of what non-traditional, non-wildfire work would look like if it's all geographically contiguous or not.
Okay, great. That's helpful. I appreciate that. Did anyone else have a question about that or thoughts?
Just one more comment on.
Go ahead.
You hear me?
Yeah.
You hear me? Okay, good. I don't think it's necessary for them to be contiguous. I don't think it's, and I think you could potentially even have multiple projects rolling up into one RRU, as long as you're not breaking any of the other abstractions, and you can, roll up risk in one direction and roll up the costs in the other direction, I think it's fine. Now, you might want to apply that as a artificial organizational criteria. Oh, we're going to do it at the project level, or we're only going to do it contiguous, but you don't actually have to do those. That's a choice.
Right, exactly. Maybe that's the way to address that, is allowing discontiguousness and contiguousness to be a choice, and it should be described clearly within a ramp application. When you're providing a narrative explanation of the RRU, you could actually highlight whether or not it's contiguous or discontiguous. Okay, great. And then the other question that's somewhat similar is that in certain cases, risk assessments are sometimes done on what's called a single asset, but in fact, or what's called it's called a single asset, such as a hydroelectric dam. But in fact, the dam itself is made up of many different systems, lots of different highly engineered systems. And so I think if the risk assessment is based on that single dam, how does that work with this idea of a risk reporting unit? And I say that because most of the mitigation projects that we've seen when we're evaluating ramps, they tend to be focused on not the entire dam, but a certain system within the hydroelectric engineering project. And so I would like to hear a little bit about how folks would address this particular issue. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, Eddie, you bring up a really good point, an interesting point. Like for dams and specifically, though, it really is a subcomponent. But I think in those cases, the subcomponent could be interchangeable through the life cycle of the project. And I'll give you some examples. You could have ways to manage the overflow or the overspill of the dam, and you can do that through various different mechanisms. But the RRU may change throughout time. So that's why it's been challenging when we started conceptualizing this RRU for dams specifically. And I get where you're coming from, and I appreciate it. It may have to change over time, just depending on the mitigation at play here.
Yeah. So, but if the mitigation is staying the same, why would the REU have to change? That's
it may change. So it may be a different component that you're changing out of the dam. So there's different ways to manage flood risk on a dam, right? You can widen the low level outlet valve. You can manage the spillway cap. Those are different components of the dam. But if we consider each one of those components in RRU, you may over time find one mechanism more cost effective than the other, or as it goes through FERC review, they may be recommending something to change.
Yeah, sure, but the RRU is the RRU itself. You may choose one RRU versus a different one, but the granularity doesn't change.
So that's different. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm most focused on here is the granularity of it. Not necessarily the switching in and out of the RRUs. That's totally understandable. But what I'm focused on here is should the granularity be focused at the dam level, or should it be focused on those components? That's what the question is.
That's right, and it could, we probably will have a lot of that work because there's a long lead, pieces of work. But just as long as there's fungibility within the type of work, that's our big concern here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the flexibility of the RRU allows there to be fungibility as long as you define it clearly. So if you're setting the RRU at that component level, just make sure that that's clear within the ramp evaluation.
Okay, so it would be still sufficient to have the dam as the tranche. I'm just making this up, and then have a subcomponent of this as the RRU. Is that right?
The dam as a tranche is another question, but yes, exactly. The risk assessment, is because this is a FERC requirement. The risk assessment is done at the dam level,
right?
But it's basically associated with different components within that dam, and then the RRU could be targeted towards those different components.
Okay, and that RRU, just to recap, it could change throughout the life cycle of the project.
I mean, the RRU granularity, or the RRU.
The RRU itself.
Yes, yes.
That's right. Okay, gotcha. Thank you, Eddie.
Yeah, sorry, Dr. Mitchell, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one thing that might help there is if you think of RUs as being ultimately derivable from a line item. I think that's the finest level of granularity on the and what the calculation is of various components at the program level. So for instance, we've got a program that is undergrounding, right? Or we have covered conductor. Well, you have in covered conductor, you have the conductor, you have the poles, you have the nuts and bolts, you have insulators. You know, there are also all sorts of things that make up putting in covered conductor. But you have you're talking about for a certain circuit segment, how much is it going to cost? Well, that can be broken down into all the various pieces of it, but effectively that's the utilities problem. Nobody else cares about that, right? So you do it how you want. Here's the amount of money you're going to spend on it. That's all you really care about. So whatever you define that, how much you're going to spend and how much you're going to, you know, what's your minimum level of spending? What's your block of spending that's visible to the commission? I think that defines your minimum possible RRU size. You can aggregate it on top of that if you want, but that you can't really go any finer than.
Yeah, and I'm just going to respond to Joe because I agree with that point, and that's sort of the concept that I think Joe you mentioned and also I mentioned earlier is that it may be prudent to think about sort of a minimum investment threshold. Just putting that out there.
Actually, Brian, do you have you guys talked?
I don't. I don't. Yeah, but I mean, to that point, I mean that's I think it gets to your point about accountability, but it also doesn't make this become just a administrative nightmare, to so to speak, right?
No, I think that there should be a certain amount of accountability but also to ensure that this is a manageable process. The goal is that what we've discovered is just that the program level doesn't provide the level of granularity that we need in order to conduct a detailed assessment for all sorts of various reasons. I think Fred actually highlighted some really good points before the break. And so, yeah, the idea of addressing this through a line item is also helpful. So I appreciate that. I also, just hearing this, I think that what you guys were just saying also makes me think that that's one of the reasons why, talking about this in terms of assets is also really important, because you can associate the risk reporting unit with reducing risk on a specific asset. And it's an asset that's, in a utility database somewhere. The question that becomes a little bit more complex is, how do we address this in terms of, these kind of non-asset-based risks? And I think that that's something that we should have a lot more further discussion on within the comment section about how to address that. But perhaps the cost threshold may be a way of addressing that more specifically, and then those particular costs could just be aggregated at the program level. But happy to hear if there's any other opinions on that. Let's move on to a second section. I just wanted to kind of feel everyone out real quick about how they feel about the risk reporting unit, the term. That's one of the reasons I put this question in here. I think there has been consternation or a little bit of concern about the term project, as we discussed within the proposal. And that's one of the reasons why we began by talking about the term scope work. But we do feel that this term risk reporting unit it's just easier to discuss, and it harkens back to the accounting principles that Matthew introduced earlier. So that's one of the reasons why we've decided to use this term. But happy to hear if there's thoughts about that. Doesn't seem like it. RRU it is. Yeah. Thanks, Fred. Yeah. So just in terms of, the question, I guess it does come to the question about, how do the idea of project and scope work and risk reporting unit, how do they interact with each other? Does everyone kind of understand that the way that we're approaching this is that, the definitions that are found, in the RDF that we're suggesting are basically built upon our assessment and our understanding of what a project is and what scoped work is. And that's where these definitions came from. Leaving aside the point that Vincent just made, that perhaps those unique identifiers and the common elements of the risk reporting unit need to be defined more clearly within the language that we're suggesting for the RDF. Yeah, does that all tend to make sense, that we're defining the risk reporting unit according to some of the principles that are associated with projects and scope work? Okay.
I think just wanted to say that I think that the definitions that you have, like scenarios and versions, I think they probably make more sense in the RMAR. But the other thing is also, when I was reading your comment here, I took a few reads and maybe I get it wrong, but it took me a few reads to get on. Well, I'm not sure yet, right? It's like, you basically suggesting a wholesale replacement of renaming of scope work to risk reporting unit. You're taking some of the same concepts for scope work, but essentially we call risk reporting unit, and there's no really definition of scope work in the RDF that you're proposing.
No, yeah, we're not planning on integrating a definition of scope work into the RDF, because if you look, the definition that we've provided in scope work is essentially the same as the definition for risk reporting unit. The only difference is that we've moved some of the language associated with, like, the life cycle and the forecastability and the auditability of the risk reporting unit. We've actually going to move that directly into row 13.1, or whichever I've labeled it as. And then that's also where I would add in some of those other characteristics of the RRU that you mentioned. I think, Vincent, just to clarify one thing, and it's actually part of this next question, is that the RRU does need to incorporate certain features that are important to the RMAR, because if it doesn't, then it's not possible to aggregate the RRU up to the program level. The RMAR would be, as eventually we'll be able to release the staff proposal, but our thought process at the moment is that the RMAR would be reported at the program level. However, if a intervener or the staff wanted to see the data that supports the RMAR, and we wanted to see the underlying data behind it, we would want to see that at the RRU level.
So this is a bit of a quandary, right? Because it's like, we can't comment too much on whether, the definitions that you're proposing in like version and scenario, whether they meet the RMAR purposes or objectives, or without actually seeing the RMAR, right? And you want opening comment before we actually see the RMAR.
So how about this, Vincent? How about for now, I leave out those unique identifiers from the staff proposal, at least in terms of what the changes would be to the RDF. And when we come to the RMAR, we can revisit that in the staff proposal, and we can have a further discussion about definitions like version and scenario and things like that. And that's actually, this is, the staff proposal itself is a prelude to that. But we won't make the changes to the RDF suggested in that part of the staff proposal until we have that discussion in the RMAR workshop. Yeah, Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. I think I had a similar question or concern as Vincent. I think until we get the concept of RRU nailed down, it's going to be hard, and also see the proposal for the other reporting, it's going to be hard to really have an opinion, an informed opinion on these other templates. So, not that we don't want to, it's just, it's hard to conceptualize it without a firmer definition.
Sure, that's understandable. I think it would be helpful to kind of think a little bit about, in general, what would be the barriers to providing a data template at the RRU level, or if there aren't any barriers, or if there are benefits to it, then providing us that information would also be helpful at this point in time too. Alternatively, when we talk about the RMAR, when we have that conversation in December, when we talk about the data templates in January, we'll just have this conversation again. We'll ask, now that you've seen the data templates, now that you've seen the RMAR proposal, let us know what you think about integrating the RRU into these particular reports, and that's fine. Now, perhaps something that we could talk about though is whether or not the RRU could be integrated into other types of accounting, such as the risk spend accountability reports or the system hardening accountability report. And I just thought I'd open that up for folks.
Yeah, this is Miles from Cal Advocates. Advocates. So as far as the RSARs are concerned, what I've been thinking about with the RSARs particularly is that the work units that get reported in RSARs are sort of these imputed authorized numbers in a lot of cases where they didn't provide that level of granularity at the work paper level, and yet they have to report them. So you end up with these imputed figures. What I'm seeing with the risk reporting units is that you're potentially actually providing a somewhat defined scope of work that's based on a forecast, and that's how you get to and that's how you create that sort of auditability and other things. And so what I'm wondering with the okay, so I see a potential problem in that you could have these RRUs that are actually providing granular work scope forecasts, but then the RSARs are potentially still reporting these imputed authorized figures, and so you'd almost have two separate reporting mechanisms. And so I'm just wondering, would these risk reporting units potentially replace these imputed authorized work unit numbers, or how can we start to reconcile these two different things?
So I'm happy to hear if anyone else has thoughts about this. My initial reaction is that the particular element that you're discussing within the RSAR is about the work unit, and the work unit essentially the work unit could just be an additional data point that's included within the risk reporting unit. You could actually have multiple work units within a risk reporting unit, or you could set the risk reporting unit at the actual scale of a work unit. So it's up to the utility to kind of define that. Work unit within the RSAR guidelines is not as well defined as I would like it to be. I was actually reviewing it the last couple of days before this, and I'm at any rate, I think that it could fit within the risk reporting unit. I don't necessarily see it as a replacement to it, because the risk reporting unit is primarily focused on risk. It's about risk reduction. Of course, there's a cost associated with that, and we can associate benefit cost ratios to a risk reporting unit. Work units, on the other hand, are imputed specifically to address the cost part of this equation, and it's associated with only, I mean, almost exclusively either a GRC application or the risk and accountability reports. And so I wouldn't want to necessarily replace that unless someone has a good justification for why it should replace that. If they feel that there is, you know, some type of confusion or ambiguity between these terms, I think it would be helpful to hear that type of perspective.
So Eddie, this is Russell from SC.
Yeah.
I just want to respond to this imputation issue. So
Okay.
the imputation of authorized in the RSR is really a function of how the commission adjudicates GRCs and not necessarily a function of how the utilities forecast their GRCs, especially how the PTYR typically works in a decided rate case. So that's why you have to impute authorized amounts to specific programs, especially in the attrition years.
Right. And so that's, I could see, again, where the risk reporting unit could be set to the exact same granularity as that work unit. But I'm not sure that at this point, I'm not quite sure that it makes sense to actually replace it, so to speak. And it's because of the, you know, the feature that the work unit actually plays within a GRC adjudication, if that makes sense. And so one of the things that could happen is in a ramp application, you know, I could envision parties having a discussion about, you know, this is what the scale of a work unit is within a GRC context. Therefore, should the RRU be set to this particular scale? And the utility could, you know, make an argument, or someone could make an argument that, you know, how does that relate to the minimum unit of risk reduction that we were just having a conversation about, you know, earlier? So that if there is like a mismatch there, then we just need to make sure that, you know, the work unit is capable of you know, being one element or one type of unit within the risk reporting unit. But I don't think that it's necessarily a replacement for it. At least I haven't quite heard a good argument for why it should be. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so I think I understand. So, I mean, they're going to coexist. They can both be useful information, and as they are now. And just because this slide also mentions, you know, it mentions the ramp and the GRCs, and I think you touched upon this earlier in the workshop, was you know, the whole definition and RRU stuff will come out in, if I just want to kind of reconfirm that this will be part of both the ramp and the GRCs, because in the ramp, that's where there could be a lot of discussion about what's being, what the granularity is with the RRU and what's being selected. And so that will be I would imagine you know, an important aspect of both the ramp and the GRC. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what the language is that we've provided, you know, as a bit of an adjustment to R.20-07-013, is that, you know, the focus will be on determining the granularity of the RRU within the ramp for each mitigation program. You know, we're at this point we're looking at the possibility of ranking each of the risk reporting units. But we can have a further conversation about that as well. And then, yeah, I mean, essentially we're integrating, just as you would with the mitigation program, you know, the utility would still need to explain like its rationale for prioritizing risk reporting units within each mitigation program. And so we would expect that there would at least be a discussion about risk reporting unit prioritization within both the ramp and the GRC. Now, the one thing that you know, we're not expecting, because I don't think that it makes sense within a GRC narrative, is to ask the utility to, you know, kind of list out each RRU within the GRC application, and for each RRU, what is the benefit cost ratio, right? those are work papers. That's like, you know, in our mind, that's like what you would find in like a data template. But it's not necessarily something that would, it doesn't make sense to like incorporate that within an actual narrative or within the GRC or the ramp for that matter.
Okay, I think we'll probably want to understand that a little better, because you know the GRC is where all the stuff gets decided on, and I think when that is brought out, like at the testimony level, maybe not a specific. I mean, maybe I can understand not wanting to flood a GRC testimony with lots of detailed numbers, but being able to have the outcome of that front and center in testimony, and then reference to work papers. Yeah, I got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the basic idea, is that the testimony would reference work papers that are set at this level of abstraction, this level of granularity. And I mean, in many cases, at least the work papers that I've seen in GRCs, they already do that. And I think that's what Russell was just discussing, you know, at the beginning, was that at least within the SCE context, there was discovery that led to you know, that level of granularity. And so making that work paper you know, a requirement of a GRC application, I think is doable. Yeah.
Thank you.
But I also want to make it clear that, and I think this is Vincent's point, that you know, we'll need to have further discussion when we talk about the RMR and when we talk about the risk reporting templates, about what that should actually look like, how the RRU should be integrated into the RMR and into the data templates. I think it's important because it defines what types of variables and what types of elements get included within the RMR and what gets included within the data templates. Any other follow-ups or questions about that? Back to, I think we still have a couple minutes, so I think we have some time to go over some questions
about cult.
I think somebody might have had some audio, but let's see. And actually, we kind of just discussed this question, and so I wanted to really quick see if we could answer this question about, you know, are there you know, certain types of risk reporting that you know, can be traced to a specific program when the funding is not project specific, and maybe we could use a little bit of time here. We've kind of talked about this a little bit, but maybe we could have a conversation about this in the context of something like veg management, and I just wanted to hear if people had some thoughts on that.
This is a really, really pertinent question that you pose here, because so many of the things in a GRC are programmatic and not project specific. It tends to be the bigger projects that are project specific. For example, you would propose to build a new substation. Well, that is clearly a project. It could even be location specific, assuming you get the right permits and everything. But something like vegetation management, they're really just authorizing the program based on a scope of how many trees are assumed that needed to be trimmed that year. So I think it definitely varies by program to program. And then there are ones that are sort of in the middle. So up until recently, programs like covered conductor were not authorized on a project basis, and I don't even think that they will be authorized on a project specific basis going forward. But specific projects can come into the GRC process, as I discussed earlier today. Those fall somewhere in the middle between a substation and vegetation management. So I think we have a lot of careful thinking to do about this very important question.
Sure. Yeah, and I think what I would like to hear a little bit about is it possible to, even though you know the funding is approved at a program level, are there disaggregations of routine veg management that we could extrapolate from that could be rolled up to the program level? And I think that's what we would appreciate hearing, I think, in comments as well. Brian, I see that you had your hand up if you wanted to add into this.
Yeah, so thank you guys. Thanks for putting this proposal together, Eddie. I think we had a good back and forth today. I think we had some constructive comments from all parties, and we really appreciate that. I think what we're going to do, just for the sake of time and given the timeline here, is we're starting to work on an alternative proposal that hopefully is going to bridge some of these gaps. I don't think we're ready to speak to every little point real time in the next 4 minutes that's scheduled here. What we want to do is just make a sturdier record of all the proposals and the commission guidance and I think perspectives that we have here. We know that party proposals are due next Tuesday, but just for the sake of time, we may ask for an extension till November 8th, but without a change to the comment period. So just wanted to put that out there. I think we get the gist of what's going on here and what you're looking for, but we just want to make sure this is workable from our perspective.
Okay, great. I appreciate that, Brian. So actually, that does help us kind of round out the next steps because we're going to have a recording that's going to be available from this presentation in about 3 to 4 days that we'll share to the service list. And then, yeah, as Brian mentioned, we're intending to have a post-workshop proposal to be filed to the docket by November 5th, pending request for an extension. And then we'll have the opening comment period will end on November 25th. So, Brian has mentioned that there wouldn't necessarily be required to have an extension to that. And the reply comments would come in on December 2nd. I agree that I think we did have a pretty good back and forth today. Oh, Dr. Mitchell, did you have your hand raised? I'm sorry, I didn't want to wrap up without.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to jump back to, for instance, vegetation management, because I was thinking about that example too. So how you find you can define vegetation management, it comes down to your program and how do you have the money divided up? How, what's the finest segment of vegetation management accounting that you do? Is it like the covered conductor where you can define that at the circuit segment level, or is it just for an area? Well, that whatever that area is, whether it's a circuit segment or some other unit, that defines the smallest possible unit that you would work on that. Now, vegetation management also feeds into wildfire risk reduction. So what vegetation management, covered conductor, underground, all these things get tied together. They all affect the risk in the circuit segment level, but they may not have costs associated at the circuit segment level. So your RRU would not be any, your RRU should be consistent for all of, you should have the same, be working from the same risk reduction, risk mitigations for that particular RRU. So for instance, if you had an RRU that spanned an area where you had trees and one where you had chaparral, well, the circuit segments in the chaparral probably wouldn't have any risk reduction budget. Those would not be assigned to vegetation management, whereas the place where there are trees, just assuming it was one giant budget, those would be defined. So you would not want to split, you would not want to have your RRU defined over that boundary. You'd want to break your RRU at the boundary where over here we're doing vegetation management and all these other mitigations that apply for wildfire. And outside of that, we're doing all those other ones, but we're not doing any vegetation management. That's how I think all that would work together. And you can, that's sort of the minimum requirement, and any other requirements or abstractions you want to put on top of that are just fine.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on what you said, Joe, it gets more complex than that because some vegetation management is compliance and some is not. And it's also the way I think we heard it earlier is that we'd have to somehow proportionally allocate the risk reduction of each of those incremental components, which makes it
No.
more complex.
No, I don't think you need
It's
to
not,
do that. No, I don't, it's,
I don't, but I think that's how the proposal reads.
okay, well, then the proposal should be tweaked in order to accommodate that.
Right.
And I
'Cause you
think we're
don't-
happy to hear suggestions about how to tweak that in order to make that happen. I'm not sure, Brian, that the proposal currently actually says that. I think that was something that we talked through earlier as a possible solution to this. What we were concerned about is the possibility that there might be a many-to-one type of approach that could make things confusing in terms of tracing accountability. But if we need to make it more explicit, that in certain instances, many-to-one, it is something that needs to be considered. We just need to hear what the proper approach to that would be.
Yeah, and I think what I said earlier about it pointing. So for instance, you have a circuit segment that has vegetation. Well, that would be attached to your circuit vegetation management budget, even in the case where you've got one vegetation management budget for the entire ramp. That it would point to that. So you don't have to divide it up. You would say, oh, well, the cost for this will come out of this pool. You don't actually have to divide it up in any sort of arbitrary way.
Okay. Great. I've actually run through most of my slides, and I think we've had a really good conversation today. We're about 3 minutes over time, so I think I'm going to let everybody go, and we look forward to the conversation continuing in the comment period. And then, of course, we look forward to having further conversations on workshop 2 related to risk tolerance, simple optimization, and overall residual risk, and also workshop 3, where we'll be talking about RMR. And then in track 2, we'll be talking about the data templates. So thanks everybody for joining today. And yeah, thank you, Emily. I'm going to remember to save the chat. All right, let me stop the recording.